thank you so much for making out the time and jumping on the call. Yeah, today, I think in terms of how we're going to run the AMA today, we want to spend the first 10 or 15 minutes, just giving you an overview of Madica. We'll talk a little bit about who we are, why we're doing what we're doing. Spend a little bit more time talking about the application journey and the entire journey really for founders who are part of Madica's family or Madica's portfolio. Share some metrics that we're very proud of the work we have been doing in the last 2 years as a fund in Africa, and then want to make out enough time after that to really dive deep into some of the questions that a lot of you already have. Some have sent questions ahead of time. We're very appreciative of that. Hopefully at the end of this session, as many of you who have joined who are not familiar with Madica, we'll have a deeper understanding of who we are and why we're doing what we're doing in the ecosystem. For those who are familiar with Madica and the work we're doing, hopefully this AMA session provides even deeper insights into the work that we're doing. In that case, I would just do a quick presentation. All right. So, like I said, next 10, 15 minutes, we'll really just be spending time talking through Madica, who we are. And if you have any questions, I appreciate if you drop them in the chat. Once we are done with the presentation, we'll go through the list and answer as many questions as we can. Yeah, so just jumping right into it, Madica, who we are. Now, on the high level, we like to describe ourselves as an intersection between a hybrid between a VC fund and an accelerator program. However, what really sets us apart is why we're doing or what drives the mission behind, Madica. And for us, is based on the belief that there are exceptional founders across Africa. I think a lot of that has been validated given the number of great startups that we have seen in the last few years, a few unicorns that we're starting to see. We've also seen, increasing trend of VC funding across the continent growing, with the exception of, I guess, last year. But in the last 5 to 7 years, the strong validation that this ecosystem is thriving is also based on the number of investments, number of, investors who are excited about the continent and driving those investments. So underlying all of that is that as Madica, we're very, very optimistic about the African ecosystem. And we do believe that great founders, exist across Africa, right? Now, building on that is underlying the trend that we've seen is that, a lot of the investments that have come into the continent in the last, say, 5 years have sort of been concentrated in certain hubs or certain geographies more than others. But I think, there's a term that has been used to describe that as the big four markets or big four, ecosystems in Africa, which would be, Nigeria or your Kenya, or your South Africa, and your Egypt, with good reasons. They are the most matured markets. They have, a thriving middle class, that makes more of the market. Investors are very, very attracted to those markets for different reasons. And for those, factors, those hubs have benefited in terms of VC interest more than others. But for Madica, what we're trying to, or what we believe is that outside of those big hubs, whether it's by geography, whether it's by, sector, where we have seen even fintech, for instance, has attracted the most funding in all ecosystems across Africa. I think in the last funding report, I think about 60% of all VC funding coming to Africa was just going into fintech, right? So there are certain categories or demographics that have been able to attract funding more than others. And so for Madica, what we believe is that we can also find and support underrepresented founders who may not be in this really, attractive hub that VC investors, are investing in, whether it's by geography, whether it's by this business model that they are building, whether it's even by the founder profile in terms of demography. And so for us, we wear a different hat, where it's like, we want to do VC in Africa, but underlying that is that we want to also be able to support founders who may be in categories that are underfunded or underrepresented on the continent as at today, right? So that's sort of the thesis and what drives us. And what we believe is that those same kinds of founders, if given the right support in terms of critical capital and hands-on support, and give them enough networking effect from an ecosystem building standpoint, then those founders, stand the same chance of being successful in the African continent as much as a founder who is building a similar solution in a big market or in a more matured market. Right? So that's Madica's vision and what drives what we are doing holistically. A lot of what we'll be talking about is how we are now driving that values. What are the pillars that form how we provide this kind of support to, the kind of founders that we are sort of discussing or be discussing throughout today. Now, everything I have said, a simple way for us to sort of categorize Madica's pieces or pillars of support in the ecosystem is threefold. We call them the three Ps. On the one hand, capital. We want to be able to support founders, like I said, with critical, financial support from a VC standpoint. Our ticket size right now is maximum of 200K, and we would typically be investing in the pre-seed stage, which is the really early stage. And the reason why we do that is because we realize that's the really critical stage that these founders really need the most support. And if we can find enough underrepresented founders at that early stage and can support them, then the chances of success long-term in growing a startup in this underrepresented markets would be a lot higher. So right now we're doing 200K investments, looking at really early stage pre-seed, and we're looking at founders, or we're looking to help founders build, strong foundations, scale operations, and unlock growth with that capital. And that's one pillar. The second pillar is around curriculum. And we use curriculum here loosely. We are very differentiated from your typical, what I would say, accelerator program. We do have an 18-month, support that we have carved out. It's very, very personalized to each startup based on what we believe, based on, conversations with the founders and aligning on what their critical gap exists in the business to now craft out what an 18-month support journey would look like. And a lot of that will be focused on helping them to, drive growth in 18 months, promote founder well-being, and try and get to secure follow-on funding. And the 18 months is actually very, very, intentional, because what we have seen in the ecosystem is that most startups who raise funding would typically go back to raise funding within an 18 months, cycle. And so for us is, can we give you enough capital that will last you, say, 18 months? And then within those 18 months, can we provide you with critical support that will get you from point A, that you are, to point B, where at point B you would have met, what we believe are really attractive milestones, that when you're going out to raise your follow-on funding, it would be a lot more easier to engage with investors. You find it a lot more attractive, and that fundraising round would be relatively easier than if you didn't have Madica's support and input. And the last pillar would be community. We sort of understand that for any ecosystem to grow, there's a need to have a thriving community, whether of founders, of mentors, of investors, people who understand that startup journey, they understand the challenges, investors who also are very interested in supporting founders who are building really disruptive and innovative solutions and bringing them into that community. Now, a lot of founders actually, particularly in underrepresented or smaller markets outside of the Big Four, struggle to access those really valuable communities. And at Madica, we sort of understand that challenge and that gap. And for us, is bringing that community closer to those kinds of founders if you're within, the Madica family and you're part of the Madica portfolio. So that's the three Cs that sort of encapsulates how we're thinking about bringing in value to the ecosystem. So just going over it one more time, it's by providing capital, which is very critical at the really early stage, providing a support program that spans 18 months, which is the typical timeline for next fundraising round, and very critical for us to be able to prove that this business can grow and provide value for follow-on investors. And then community, where these founders have access to a larger community on the continent of founders with similar struggles, who understand what it takes to build a startup, investors who are passionate about the ecosystem, and mentors who are also critical supporting pillars to help founders actually navigate some of the challenges in running a startup on the continent. Just in terms of what we have done so far, as of today, we have 8 active companies in the portfolio across 6 sectors. Now, 100% of our portfolio companies have majority African ownership. That is also very critical for us. I think, one of our core tenets is that we are supporting African founders, right? As a matter of fact, it's represented in the name madica. So for those who may not know, madica literally is made in Africa. So it's an African VC, and we're really passionate about supporting African, startups. And one way that we think we're driving value is that majority ownership of whatever startup we invest in should be based on of African descent. From a geography standpoint, I think what we've done also very good is the geographic diversity within the portfolio, where the investments span across 8 different countries. We have 16 founders from different nationalities. Another metric that I think we're very proud of is the female CEO, or at least gender diversity within the portfolio itself, where 50% of the female CEOs in our portfolio companies are ladies, and 54% at least have representation within the C-level or founding team. So that's sort of sheds more light into how we're thinking about it. We want to go as wide as possible. We want to open up the opportunities to, underrepresented founders, whether it's by geography, whether it's by business model, whether it's by their demography. And a lot of that reflects in some of the metrics that, we're showing today. Yeah, maybe just a quick snapshot of the portfolio. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but we have some really interesting investments right now. We have investment in Ghana, Polar Markets. We have in South Africa called Newfound Foods, doing something really impressive in biotech. In Ghana, it's really an e-commerce play. GoBeba is in Kenya, very focused on bulk, utility from a logistics standpoint, really impressive founders. We have Edbond in Nigeria, who is driving sustainable energy adoption by providing financing. We have Medicare in Tanzania, which is doing, really innovative things in healthcare. Motherbeam in Egypt, which is driving AI-powered, app for women's health, particularly in the MENA region. We have Pixie Motors that is doing smart mobility in Tunisia, and then we have Tumine in Morocco that is using, AI and analytics to drive consumer insights for enterprise clients. So this is really just highlighting the diversity in our portfolio, from both the kinds of ideas that we back, but also, diversity in the location that we're sort of looking at. I'll spend a bit more time on this slide because I think this would be the most valuable, or one of the most valuable information that we could share on this AMA. So it's the founder journey from when you start your application up until the end of the 18 months program. So it's essentially, 5, I would say, journey points. The first, point is really the initial application and screening, which some of you may have already had some experience with. For those that do not, I'll share some highlight on that. And so your engagement with Madica typically would start at, sending in an application. So we have, as of today, 2 application stages. So we have a stage 1 application where we sort of ask high-level information to better understand, your team, your business at a high level. That stage 1 application allows us to measure, the strategic fit with Madica's pieces, like I said. For startups that make it through stage 1 and we see a great strategic fit, usually a follow-up email will be sent inviting you for a stage 2 application. The stage 2 application now asks for more commercial information on your startup. Questions like traction, USP, questions that give us deeper insights into the commercial viability of what it is that you're building. And after stage 2, for startups that actually stand out and are shortlisted, we would usually invite them for a founder call. So that would be the first check-in or first point where founders and the Madica team would actually have a conversation. And the objective of the screening call is to gain deeper insights. So now we've seen your stage 1, you strategically are aligned with what Madica is looking for. We've seen your stage 2, we've seen, commercial metrics that make you very interesting for a VC fund. And now we want to get to, meet the founders, understand the journey, ask, follow-up questions or deeper questions to really understand your differentiation, your USP, why you think, what you're building would win in the market. For some sectors, they are very saturated. And so it's very interesting when we get on those calls and we can actually spend time with founders and really understanding what is the unique insight about what you're building that makes you believe you would win. And just, conversations are usually very valuable because we learn a lot on those calls. And we find that founders also learn a lot because we come into those calls very prepared, really curious about understanding what you're building, oftentimes share insight about what we know about the market or other similar markets. And, based on that conversation, we're able to gauge if this is a Madica fit company. Now, if we get to the point and we believe that there's something here and we want to actually, spend a bit more time, understanding or potentially investing, it would lead to what we describe as the due diligence and investment decision stage. So that would be stage 2. Now, what that would look like is this is where we formally now communicate to you, hey, we really love what you're doing. We think there's something there. We potentially want to go to IC in the next few weeks. And so we want to spend the next 4 to 6 weeks doing due diligence on the business. This is typically the stage where, for founders on the call who understand what that process looks like, you should already have your data room set up, you share it with us. We're also very keen on speaking with, stakeholders, partners, co-founders, investors that are familiar with what you're doing. Because a lot of what we do at this stage, particularly early stage, is really market insight driven. And so we like to get those insights by speaking with as many people as possible. So our due diligence process actually is very heavy on primary research, primary, market insights, speaking with people and understanding what the opportunity there is. All of that culminates into an investment memo, an investment report that at the end of that process, if the investment team still has strong conviction on the business, we have an investment memo ready and then we go to IC for approval. For startups that have gone through IC and gotten approval, the next few steps are relatively easy, where we hand over you to legal, and legal just does pre-qualificational checks to ensure that you are structurally and legally structured correctly to actually receive investments. What we found is it's a lot easier if startups have already done a lot of the work before we even start due diligence, which we usually would share ahead. So one of the criteria, for instance, is we have a preference for investing in, holding companies that are registered in, say, Delaware, UK, or any OECD compliant, jurisdictions. And so that typically is what legal will spend a lot of time ensuring that those structures are set up well. Flip-up process has been complete. All legal docs are, assigned, and we have access to it and verified. And then, once that's done, you sign your agreement, and then funds are wired. And then officially you're part of the Madica portfolio, and then your 18 months journey sort of starts. That 18 months journey, and I think I'll touch on a bit on some of the program elements on the next few slides. But like I said, it's really very heavy on working hand in hand with founders. In a lot of ways, it's really founder-led, where we want you to tell us what you need. We provide you with the expert advice. We'll structure that entire program and the experience with the way that suits how you like to receive, support. And we agree on what milestones would be at the end of 18 months, where you're like, hey, if I want to go from a 100K ARR business, and you believe the next milestone for you before you raise your next long funding is to meet $1 million ARR, it's our job as your investors, but also as your partners, to now structure what that journey will look like to $1 million ARR, and try and ensure you actually meet these goals in the next 18 months, and then help you go out into the market to raise follow-on funding. And then at the end of that, 18 months, we have a community that we're building. And so after 18 months, you're still part of the Madica family. It doesn't end at the end of the 18 months. And so, yeah, it's a unique journey that hopefully spans a lifetime. Now, just touching on a few things on what the program offers. So as a fund, we've had some time to sit back and really think about what is it that Madica wants to do really well? What would define us as a fund in the ecosystem? And we have, come up with 4 things from a value creation or a value addition standpoint to, the portfolio companies. It's fundraising, it's growth, it's governance, and it's founder well-being. I won't spend too much time on this, but fundraising, it's any startup or any founder that is part of the Madica portfolio. One thing that should be able to benefit instantly is help or assistance with fundraising, where it's like if you're currently raising a round when we made a commitment to invest, it's now our responsibility, or we take it as our responsibility, to actually help you close that round while we prepare you for the next fundraising round. And we find that that's actually very, very valuable, particularly when we consider the category of founders that we are now sort of working with, where fundraising could be challenging because you're in a smaller market, or fundraising is challenging because your business model is not fintech, or gender or founder demographic in some senses could also influence how easy it is to actually raise this funding. And so for Madica, that now becomes our responsibility, where it's like, hey, as a Madica founder, we are committed to helping you close your current round, but more importantly, helping you start to get ready for the next fundraising round, and providing you with all the guidance and support it takes to actually do that. Second category is growth. I mean, the whole point of a startup is for rapid growth. And as Madica, we also want to be partners in driving that growth. So whatever you need, whether it's from strategic guidance, technical assistance, is it tools and resources you need, we are more than happy to provide you with every critical things you need to be able to support that growth. Third point is governance. What we've seen is that, oftentimes founders are very focused on the first 2, which is fundraising, because again, it's very challenging, and we understand. Growth as well, because that's what investors want to see. How fast are you growing? When are you meeting your next milestones? And not a lot of emphasis is really paid to governance. But we also understand how critical governance is, particularly when you start to raise larger rounds like the seed round, the Series A. And so that is also another pillar where we're like, hey, we want to be able to actually help founders structure their governance such that when they're actually going out to raise, they have this locked down and they have everything, figured out. And then the last one is really founder well-being. And the reason why this is important is because, Flourish, which has done a recent survey around, founder well-being, and actually uncovered that a lot of founders really don't believe that they're getting the right kind of support from their investors, right? So beyond writing checks and asking for monthly check-ins and feedback, they really don't feel like they're being, actually supported by their investors. And for us, that is one key pillar, where it's like beyond, the investments, beyond the investment in Madica in startups, we also understand that, startup founders are humans at the end of the day. They have daily struggles outside of work. They have challenges just like everyone else. And it's for us is to create an enabling environment, right, that reinforces that belief. And so, if it's in terms of executive coaching, bringing you into, communities with your peers, fostering that safe environment where founders can really just feel like, hey, I'm a great founder, but at the same time, I'm human, and there's a investor that sort of understands that journey as a fourth pillar that we're sort of bringing into that mix. In terms of how the program works, and I know we're slightly going over time as promised, but really, like I said, we're not structured as a typical theater program, but overall, we have check-ins with founders, where it's like you're assigned a lead mentor, where you have one-on-one. So your lead mentor is really your partner on that journey. And you have one-on-ones with them, you share some of the challenges you have, you align, you agree on what your good milestones are. The lead mentors usually, if there's challenges that requires, Madica's intervention, we hear back from lead mentors, oftentimes directly from founders, but lead mentors usually are the ones who work hand in hand with founders, and Madica can intervene, whether it's through our local network or global network. And then we have board meetings, which is something that we're, that I think is very critical, where startup founders actually start to feel a sense of fiduciary duty in what they are, building. It's like, hey, maybe a pre-seed company, but very soon you're going to be a Series A company. And regular reports to particularly your boards is something that we want to start sort of, imbibing in startup founders really early. And those board sessions are really, really valuable because you get a lot of insight from global experts in what is they're building and help you craft your growth strategically. Outside of that, we have working sessions, usually medical sessions, where it's really workshop and bootcamp style. We bring, experts in and speak on specific topics. And these topics usually based on feedback from founders, like, hey, this is what we're struggling in. And so this is where we need additional support. And so we take advantage of these sessions to oftentimes bring in experts in particular areas to share some light and hopefully provide value to startup founders. Similar with executive coaching and founder circles, is really just what are these regular check-ins where we can provide value, whether it's for the business directly or really just from a network standpoint. From a monthly standpoint, we have monthly reports, quarterly reports, pretty standard things that every founder already do today if they already have investors. And then on the last piece is the immersion trips. This is, one I'm very excited about. So part of how we support founders is around what we describe as immersion trips. And this falls within the, community, pillar that we had earlier discussed, where it's like one thing that founders in Africa, generally need, apart from capital and curriculum, there's also exposure element to it, where, you may be a startup founder in Morocco, for instance, and, not have the adequate access to other parts of the continent, even from a networking standpoint. And so this immersion trip help address that gap, where within that 18 months program, every startup is allowed or could embark on 3 of these immersion trips. And how that works is, the madica team spends a lot of time or months really figuring out what new ecosystem do we want our founders to explore, right? Oftentimes we found that it's also valuable to align it with global conferences where you have a lot of investors already there. But the underlying objective is to be able to have all our founders at once go explore a new ecosystem, spend a couple of weeks, and we take advantage of that to create conversations with other startup founders, unicorn, investors, or really important stakeholders. And so every immersion trip would be different in its activities, but also in its location across Africa, and oftentimes actually in other ecosystems out of Africa. I know we have been able to do an immersion trip in London, and I think the last one was in Kenya. Yeah. And so, there's going to be opportunities for other immersion trips in other ecosystems that we deem very valuable to our portfolio companies. I'm just going to run through the presentation quickly. I know we didn't have much time, but for those who may not be familiar with the team, we run a pretty lean team, actually. I'm Francis, so investment associate, mostly on the investment side. We have Emmanuel Adeboye, who's the head of Madica, sticking out of London and sort of oversees our entire operations. We have Akinyi, who's the head of portfolio based in Nairobi. We have Shamsa, who is the head of comms, also based in Nairobi. And then we have Samza, who is the finance and operations manager based in Tunisia. So even within the team, I think we still maintain our values around being very diverse, both in demography and in location. So it's pretty lean team and pretty exciting as well. Now, a few questions that we have gotten in the past. I think I'll just spend another 5 minutes quickly running through that. And then hopefully we still have enough time to go through as many questions as you guys have at the backs of your mind. While going through this presentation, I didn't get a chance to actually mention Flourish a lot, but a lot of what we do is backed by the vision of the Flourish team. Flourish Ventures, for those who may not be familiar, is a global VC fund backed by the Media Network and are very focused on supporting founders, particularly in advancing financial health and prosperity. They do growth stage investments, typically pre-series A and above. And so it's a global fund, but also has exposure on the African continent in terms of working with founders and investing in founders. And it was because of that exposure on the African continent that the gap in terms of how funding is being allocated was, realized, and how structural and endemic it was. And it was out of that, need to address that challenge that Madica was now formed. So we do have an affiliation with Flourish, and it was because of the work they have done that Madica's, was born out of. Another question we have gotten quite recently or frequently is in terms of equity for investments. Now, we don't do straight, or we haven't done, maybe it's a better way to phrase it, straight equity deals. Primarily, we use safes or similar instruments in our investments. And so usually terms would revolve around having a valuation cap, but not straight equity. In terms of the vision, I hope I have done a good job of reiterating this, but really what we're trying to do, is try to address some of the structural gaps that may be undermining innovation and entrepreneurship across Africa. We understand that mission-driven founders could exist all over Africa, but for certain reasons or certain factors allow some founders benefits or at least get better opportunities to grow and scale versus others. And for us at Madica, it's like, hey, we want to also support these kinds of founders who share the same level of passion, who have the same level of challenges in their ecosystems, right? But structurally, have challenges actually getting critical support in terms of capital, in terms of, support from mentorship or exposure. And that's really, what drives Madica. Do we have a cohort program? We don't operate cohort-based program. So it's really rolling basis, and it's very tailored to the unique needs of each startup, like I said. So whatever points, part of the medical family, at that point, your journey starts, and your support program is sort of structured around what the next 18 months look like. I think I'll just pause here and see if we have any questions. Hopefully we do have a lot of questions. I would encourage you to send in your questions on the chat. We may not have enough time to give everyone room to speak. So if you can just type in your questions, we can go through them and see how much of that we can cover in the next few minutes. Do we have any questions in that?
Hey, Francis. Yes, we do. Kindly check the Q&A.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the first question I have here is, how do you combine accelerator support and investment support? At what stage of the journey do you consider providing funding? We're at MVP stage after a very few successful pilots. Beyond our founding team, including our technical owner, we just onboarded an operations lead. MVP has gone live. So I think this is a two-part question. How do we combine accelerator support and investment support? And then the second one is, I believe, is asking about the stage which we believe or we think is the most attractive for us as a fund. So I'll start the second one first. At what stage we're looking at would, I think it's kind of just subjective, but I'll shed a bit more light on that. We typically have a preference for pre-seed companies. Now, these are companies typically that have some level of market validation. It's still very early stage, but at that point, you have clearly identified the problem. So whether it's a market pain point, you've identified who potential customers are, you've built an MVP, right? But more importantly, you've actually gone out to test market acceptance for that MVP. So usually, I think at the point where it gets very interesting for Madica is where there's actual, validation from a market standpoint, either from, paying customers or early adopters that show that, hey, people are actually willing to pay for this solution or service, and you're actually solving a real pain point. At that point, that becomes a lot more interesting for Madica. What I'll also say is, as a caveat, is there are certain business models that may be too much of an ask. One example of that is if you're doing deep tech or biotech, oftentimes that sector requires years of research before it can be commercialized. So at that point, even if you don't have early validation from a customer standpoint, I think other metrics we can use to evaluate that could be, hey, how deep are you in your research? Are there any licenses that you've already secured? Those are other forms of traction outside of paying customers, other sort of growth metrics that we typically look for. But at Madica, I think it's really pre-seed. And what it would be helpful at that pre-seed stage is really, hey, you clearly identified a market segment that has a unique pain point. Are you addressing, big enough problem? And is there evidence that, there are people who are willing to pay for this? And oftentimes the best evidence of that is you have a few customers who are actually paying or willing to pay. And, that could be interesting. Your first question around how we combine accelerator support and investment support. So for us, our investment, by the way, comes upfront. So the program is a post-investment support, right? So we invest first, and then you benefit from the program. But after we've also made that investment, other support we bring into the table is now, hey, say you were raising a 500K round, Madica commits 200K, one form of investment support is like, hey, how can we catalyze the remaining 300K so you close your round, soon enough, and we can now spend the next 18 months actually building a business that would be valuable and would find it easy to raise the next funding round, right? So that's how we think about it. Accelerator support, I would prefer the term post-investment support. So it's not an accelerator in traditional sense, but we are very committed to providing what we believe is critical or catalytic support in a span of 18 months, where it's like, hey, we have all these resources, we have all this network as Madica. How much of this can you take advantage of in 18 months to get you from where you are to the next milestone, where when we're speaking to investors in the next 18 months, you're like, hey, this is a very good business and it'll be very difficult to say no. I think that's sort of why we're different from a typical accelerator program, right? I hope that answers that. Please provide more information on the sectors that Madica supports. Okay, good. So as a fund, we are sector agnostic. But I think this is a very good opportunity to maybe shed a bit more light on some of or how the strategic criteria could influence, Madica's decision. So just going back to what is driving Madica and how we're sort of thinking about participating in the ecosystem, there are, I would say, 3 categories of underrepresentation that we have seen in the ecosystem. There's the, market underrepresentation, where, the big 4 markets account for 70% of all funding. So in light of that, we have if we find investments that are outside the big 4 markets, we do want to spend a bit more time looking at these ones, because those are some of the founders in those markets have a bigger challenge raising funds than in the big 4 markets. From a sector standpoint, we've seen that fintech is the largest sector attracting funding. So as an investment team, if we're able to actually find really great startups that are non-fintech, because those are the ones that struggle to actually attract, funding, we would, love to spend a lot more time on those founders or on those startups. And then the third category would be, sort of like, demography. So one example of that would be founder profiles. Also find teams that have gender diversity on the team or female-led, founders. That's generally exciting for us. We want to be able to support them, because going back to where the gap exists, female-led ventures actually, struggle a lot more than, male-led teams when it comes to fundraising and accessing certain kind of critical support. So at every point in time when we make decisions, we also want to evaluate how well we're doing in supporting across these categories. Now, going back to your questions around sectors, we're sector agnostic, but when we now sort of, layer on some of the strategic fit, while you maybe were sector agnostic, it would be a fintech company in a big market like Nigeria is probably a hard sell, because in that sense, Madica's funds and support may not be the catalytic in that sense, because you're already in a big market where we have seen that raising funding is a lot easier than other emerging markets, and fintech as well is a very, very attractive sector for most VCs. Now, what could happen in those situations is that, look, we're happy to help you in any other ways, but for Madica's funding, maybe there are other founders that are in other underrepresented categories that would best or find a lot more value in the support we have. But that doesn't mean your business isn't great. Oftentimes what we've done is actually help with introductions to other investors. They're like, hey, strategically, this may not be a fit for Madica, but it's a great business, and happy to do intros to other investors. So just to reiterate, we're sector agnostics, but when we lay on other strategic criteria, the sector alone may not be the only factor that we consider. What are the investment terms for the 200K? We use a simple SAFE, usually based on, and we align on what a fair valuation cap is, right? If there's room for negotiation, would usually want to be able to negotiate, but I think we are very, very interested in ensuring that there's enough value for founders. I would say we're not cutthroat in that negotiation per se, but I think that there's going to be an alignment with founders. Hey, this is what we feel the market is saying about the valuation cap. Oftentimes founders, come to us with an acceptable valuation cap and we'll just, go ahead. But we're very careful with ensuring that our investment actually provides enough value for founders. And so we just use a SAFE with a valuation cap that we both agree on. How many get into DD and how many get the ICO approval so far? That's a very, very interesting question. I would say, and we actually just recently did this calculation, I think about 70% right now is the 70 to 80% would be that number of startups that we have invited to DD, spend time, reviewing them, and then getting an ICO approval. So I would say about 70 to 80%. It's quite high. Are you investing in traditional industry like agriculture and food processing? I mean, if you're talking about, if there's I would say tech element to it, I think it could be interesting. But I mean, I don't see us, when you say agriculture, it's not quite clear. We're investing in, say, a large farm that produces certain kinds of agro commodities, probably not. We're a VC fund at the end of the day. We want to invest in startups, startups that either it's innovation from a process standpoint, from a technology standpoint, from maybe even a software standpoint, have designed some unique innovation that is disruptive and has the ability to scale quite rapidly. It is still what we're looking at, right? So I underline everything that I have said about Madica. We're still a VC fund and we make decisions like a VC fund. And so if you can actually show that either in agriculture or food processing, there's a unique innovation that you're bringing into it that would allow for, massive efficiency that can scale quite rapidly, then yeah, I mean, I think any investor would be very interested in exploring that or possibly investing. But if it's a pure traditional play, probably not. What are the requirements for startups to join Madica? Do you support startups that don't have an MVP yet? And what about those with just a prototype? Would they still be eligible for support? I think the requirement is be African first, be an African startup. Let me rephrase that. Like I said, we back African startups, so at least be an African startup. And that is also reflected by, hey, who actually owns the company? What is the percentage of African ownership? I think that's a very interesting and key criteria for us. With prototype, I think going back to what I said, if you are in deep tech or biotech, there's a strong case that can be made for a prototype being sufficient. But if you're in other sectors, I think as an ecosystem, it's a lot tougher to, not only access funding, but actually go to market. And so for startups that have actually done one or two steps, I think have shown some level of resilience. And usually that's also very attractive to investors. So if you are, say, a fintech with just a prototype, except what you're building is like truly, truly, truly disruptive, I think the preference is that there's some level of, traction post prototype and maybe have an MVP that we can evaluate and estimate the level of, attraction in the markets is generally preferred. There could be exceptions if, you really stand out and the prototype is really attractive and you're in a market that could truly be disrupted. that is also, acceptable. But I think generally most VCs tend to shift towards, hey, maybe have an MVP, maybe have some early traction from customers and whatnot. Sometimes founders lack capacity to think business lean. Can this hinder approval of a great project as you come in to support at stage 4? I'm not sure I completely understand this question, but if we're talking about post-investment and there is a gap in terms of, founders that can think strategically, then yes, that's one of the gaps that we are designed to fill. Oftentimes, you find really technical founders. They're really great at technical stuff, but now they are now building a business. They've gotten capital and are struggling to figure out what's the best way to allocate this capital, how's the best way to structure a team, how's the best way to document a go-to-market strategy. All of that support that Madica can help address. So if that's what you're asking, then yes, we offer that support, and may not be a strong factor enough for us to not approve a great project. So if you're a technical founder, maybe you don't have a lot of business experience. If we see the value in what you're building and the potential in the market, helping you with sort of like strategic, strategic thinking, or helping you, filling your team with, a bit more business oriented or strategic hires, yeah, more than happy to support that. So that shouldn't hinder, or at the end of the day, we're evaluating based on the potential of the project. And any other things that we think Madica can address via the support program, it's a plus. What are the tips to make an impression at initial screening, especially at this early stage? From my experience, it is easier to do it at the call, but that opportunity is not easy to come by. For example, Google is in a very crowded space. Utility delivery is ubiquitous and free delivery in Nairobi. How did they sell it? That's a very interesting call. On this particular one, unfortunately, I may not be able to provide as much insight on this because, this deal in particular precedes my journey in Madica. It was a deal that I had already closed. And so I didn't really, spend a lot of time on that deal. But maybe to give some tips on making a first impression at initial screening at this early stage, I think as investors, we have seen a lot of businesses or business ideas, whether it's in the markets that we're investing in or globally. There's a lot of case studies that have been done. We may not have, or all investors may not have, deep understanding of each sector, but generally, I think most investors, particularly in the investment side, are well versed with, what are the new innovations happening in the new sector, what is driving it, what are the trends, what are the challenges, right? So oftentimes when we go into those initial screening calls, what we're really looking for is unique impact that founders bring about this market that we may not have known, or that we know, but they can, defend why they are still pursuing that opportunity or why this is very unique. I think that extra unique insights usually is what stands out. And, just really know why, or the market you're playing in, and what gap your solution is filling, and you can back it up. It's generally helpful because these calls usually, investors too would have done their, research. And I'm not speaking for Madica exclusively. I think any fund or investors that you're speaking with, when they go on those calls, they already have a general idea about the business model or the sector, particularly the challenges. And so if you go on those calls, I think you need to be able to, defend why, maybe defend is a strong word, but at least address or clearly articulate how you are solving this problem. If it's a problem that is not new, then you want to focus on how you're solving it differently and what is unique about the model that you're doing that will make it very, very, attractive or very, very scalable. Because at the end of the day, that is what you're being evaluated on as a startup. How quickly can this scale, given all these challenges in the market? So maybe that's just one tip. Just come in with the idea of really articulating, hey, this is the gap that exists today. This is how inefficient it is being solved. This is why we're doing things this way. And this is why we're going to get to X in the next 5 years. And you have your reasons and your points. And so when investors ask questions, it's like, these guys have really thought about this thing and they really know what they're doing. And that's generally helpful. That's just one tip from me. What is your exit strategy should you become equity partners? I mean, we're a VC fund, so exit, I think for us is really, we're patient. I think we'd like to spend a bit more patient capital because we understand how important some of this early stage support is for some of the founders. So we're a bit more patient. We know it will take longer. But from an exit standpoint, hey, if we find opportunities for, I think an IPO is perfect. In Africa, at least, I think we're a few years away from seeing really, a lot of IPOs and exits from those opportunities. But I think M&As are still, or secondary exits from future fundraisers are still very viable. But right now, I think what we're really trying to do is support founders, be a bit more patient with their growth, provide them with as much support, and if there are opportunities to exit, much further down the road, which would typically come in form of an M&A or secondary, exit, that could be an opportunity for us to exit as a fund. How do we apply? Okay. So to apply to Madica, just visit the website, madica.vc/apply. You see a form. It's a very short form, taking maybe 5 to 7 minutes to fill. And then, we take the conversation on from there, from the back end. You did mention the check size that Madica invests. So we invest 200K. It's our standard ticket size today. So it's 200K in a safe across the investment we have done. How much time does the founder's journey take? Very great question. So the founder journey starts from application. Like I mentioned, there are 2 application stages. And what we've found is, on average, it would take anywhere from, I think, less than a week. Oftentimes, if there's any delays, 2 weeks for you to complete that process. So usually, if you apply, I believe in a week, you should hear back if we want to, ask for more information in stage 2 or not. And then once you provide us with that information, we can also come back to you with, hey, we want to actually invite you for a screening call or give you, reasons why we may not be moving forward with you. So the application stage itself could be anywhere from, if I am being very conservative on the call, say 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And then after that, the due diligence stage could take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. And oftentimes it's taking a bit longer, but I think that's also one area that we are going to spend a lot of time going forward, really trying to be very efficient with our diligence process and try and get that to about 4 weeks. I think that's very, very efficient, will be very efficient going forward. So that's 4 weeks. And then the legal process could be anything from a week to, in some cases, months, depending on how much these founders still need to do or get done to be able to sign and close. So for founders that still need to go register in a holdco in Delaware, maybe in the UK, do a flip-up process, assign IP, and all of that. Some countries it's a lot more challenging than others, but I would estimate that, look, best case in a week, that can be done. The legal process. Worst case, I think it will take up to 6 months. But process we can control, I think we're trying to bring it down to about 4 to 6 weeks, and then 18 months for the program, and then post-program support. So I would estimate that from application till post-program would be anywhere from 18, 20 months, I would say, holistically. Does Madica only fund startup with female CEOs? No. We don't. We fund all startups, all kinds of startups. We have portfolio companies that are male founders, actually. And so, no, we don't fund only female CEOs. Does Madica support startup in the early prototype stage? I already answered this question. I think it depends on the sector you're in. If you're in deep tech or biotech, that's a good time to get in because it takes longer for you to actually build an MVP and go commercialize. But for other sectors, I think the preference for us is, it should show some level of traction either with an MVP or early customers. What traction do you require in terms of MRR? This is actually a very good question. It's also very subjective. I think on average of the investment we have done, the average MRR we have seen before investment, I would say was 50K. No, sorry, ARR was 50K on average. So that would mean, I would say about 4 or 5K MRR, right? It's a good validation that there's a lot of people that want this and are willing to pay for this. How much you're funding to get, how much equity. So 200K to save, we don't take equity upfront. We have a message from Irene. At what point would a business like ours be exciting to you? I mean, if you're still early stage, like I said, pre-seed. If you are seed and above, it's a lot more advanced than we prefer. Except there are unique opportunities where we see clear value where we're like, hey, maybe we should consider a seed stage bridge round or whatnot. But I think the stage is pre-seed, preferably for us. So if you're in that stage, cool. If you have an MVP, you have some level of validation or early validation, fantastic. Let's have a chat and we can go into a bit more details as to what excites us about the deal, or if not, the reasons why this may not fit into what we're looking for at the moment. But I think from a stage standpoint, it's proceed, preferably with some MVP and some early traction. Do you fund startups with founders that studied abroad but moved back to Africa to start their company? Yeah, we have. As long as, again, going back to the points about being an African venture, so it's owned by majority African founders. I think that for us is what's critical. But studying abroad, coming back, I think we do. Hello, Francis. Thank you for the presentation. What is the timeline for each of the stages for applying to Madica? We have been at the second stage for quite a bit with no further cons. That's so. I think for stage 2, the timeline for review and feedback, I would say at most is 2 weeks, because we do have volume of investments that we typically look at. What we've also found recently is that oftentimes when feedback is shared, it could end up in spam. So I encourage, founders who may not have gotten feedback, if it's been more than 2 weeks, to check out their spam. But if you still haven't heard from us in longer than 2 weeks, please just shoot us an email directly, and we'll look into that. But I think on average, we've tried to keep that review cycle and feedback cycle activities at the most. Is Madica sector agnostic? Yes, we are very sector agnostic. could you kindly elaborate more on the criteria of having a data room for a startup? Also, in terms of traction, would edited financial statement be required? If a startup has a bit of traction but doesn't have audited financial statement, is this an automatic disqualification? Right. So I guess on the first question, criteria for having a data room for a startup. So I think on this one, I think any startup that is fundraising should have a data room. But what also seen that is valuable in our process is that we actually communicate to you what detail we want in a data room. So we actually create a version on a data room for startups while doing the due diligence stage, right? So we share a checklist usually. These are the information that you need. The ones you have, share with us. We internally have a data room on all the startups that we have due diligence. And oftentimes on certain documentation that you don't have, we work hand in hand with them to actually create them, right? So an example is some startup really don't have financial control policies. And so we have, documentations where we sort of work hand in hand with startups to actually create one and have that both for their own internal use, but also for our own documentation purposes. So for us, it's very important that at the end of the due diligence phase, at least, there is a data room. If you didn't have one before starting that process, then that's where the due diligence process will be valuable for you as a startup, because at the end of that process, you will have a data room, which would be, make a lot of sense if you're also speaking with other investors. Audited financial statements, that's not a deal breaker. So if you don't have audited financial statements, you could have just been in business in the last 6 months or 8 months and don't have one. But as long as we have verifiable, statements, we can use that as well. Does Madica support investing in pre-revenue startups? If no, what is the minimum revenue required to be considered? I think I answered this. Pre-revenue, I think we're open to exploring if you're deep tech or biotech, because that sector is uniquely, structured that it takes years before you start seeing revenue. So investing in pre-revenue is, makes sense for certain investors. And in terms of minimum early revenue required, I would say on average it's like a 3K, 5K MRR. We're not, that's not cast in stone. As long as we truly believe that this business is scalable and there's some early revenue or traction, we can have a conversation and estimate if that's sufficient. But to give you some guide, I think on average what we have done in the past would have averaged between 4 and 5K, MRR. Do you fund companies operating in Francophone Africa? Yes, we want to actually. I think this is where we want to spend a lot more time this year, looking at Francophone, Africa. And so hopefully we get a lot more applications or, people just reaching out from the network, exposing us to a lot more deals. But definitely Francophone Africa is an area of interest for us, and we want to spend a bit more time in those markets and seeing how we can, support. Can you give me an estimate of how many early customers or adopters are enough to get Madica's attention? Yeah, this is also very, very subjective. So if you were a SaaS or enterprise business, I think anywhere from 2 to 3 makes sense, that you've been able to convince 3 enterprise clients to adopt your solution and pay. I think it's a good enough validation. Yes, sorry about that. And so for B2B enterprise, I think, look, we've seen guys that have very strong enterprise contracts that's sufficient. B2C, I think, ultimately wants a bit, more in terms of numbers. But I think in terms of maybe using MRR as the metric, if you can start to see 2, 3, 4K MRR from some of the early work, then that's actually attractive. Our company is currently registered in Cote d'Ivoire, but not in Delaware. Would this be a problem? If Madica expresses deep interest in our business, would you assist with the Delaware registration process as part of your support? So I mean, we can make commitments to invest, but won't close until the Delaware is registered and that is ratified. In terms of support, what we have done with other startups is either introducing you to legal counsel or experts that can help you, with that support. But we can't commit to that support because that you're not part of the portfolio yet. The post investment support happens after investment has closed. But before it closes, where we can also provide value or support is, hey, we know experts in X market or that would be best placed to advise you and hold your hands through that registration and flip up process. And so that's one area that we can also, do introductions, but not probably do it directly because it will be a conflict of interest considering it's a contract between both parties and we can't take responsibility for legalizing your structure. How does Madica have any portfolio company graduated as a raise a subsequent round? Is there a pipeline to flourish for that? It's successful. Yeah. Apologies for that. So in terms of how old Madica is, I believe we're just over or just about 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. So it's still pretty, early fund. We have, I believe, 2 companies about to graduate. And so, in the next few months, 2 of our companies will be graduating and are actually in the process of raising subsequent rounds, under which we'll be working hand in hand with them to have them close. Is there a pipeline to flourish for that? I think while we are affiliated with Flourish, we are also, in a lot of sense, in terms of the investments we do and the sectors, a bit autonomous. If we find investments that we do early stage, which are fintech, Flourish is very fintech focused, then that could be a potential, pipeline, but we're not structured to be a pipeline directly with Flourish right now. Our focus is a bit autonomous from Flourish, but in the future, as the portfolio grows and we find startup or support startups that align with Flourish's pieces as well, then that could potentially be a pipeline deal. How much time it could maximally take to close the pre-seed save with Madica for an LHA startup? So I think the best answer for this is right now we're working to streamline the process to be 3 months or less from when you apply to when it closes. So I would say it's right, like that is like 12 weeks. But I think, hey, what is important for us is to be able to actually do this a lot more efficiently and do a lot more deals and support a lot more startups. But right now, the internal target is like, can we do everything that it takes to find, evaluate, DD, IC within 3 months? in any market. And that's the goal we're working with internally. I'm just being a bit mindful of time, and so I'll just go through some of these questions a bit quicker. Our company has two operational products that generate some revenue, but we're still exploring and adjusting our business model to find a more scalable opportunity. When approaching investors like Madica, is it better to present our current portfolio of products as they are, or should we focus our pitch on the single most promising products? How transparent should we be about our own great project and finding product market fit? That's a great question. I think being transparent is preferred. I think as a funnel, I think we're also very, very transparent in a lot of the things that we do. So I think with Madica specifically, we encourage you to come into that conversation, transparent and have a conversation, right? We are not, I think we strive to be as founder friendly as possible and really understand the journey of founders. We understand that oftentimes, you may have not figured everything out, which is okay. And then we evaluate, if we can support you or how we can support you. And if we can, for strategic reasons or for whatever reasons, we're also very transparent with that. And like, hey, this is why we can't. This is our honest feedback about the business. This is where we think you can work on or what you should do. And so, transparency is always encouraged. And I think it goes both ways. If a startup has a female African founder, but due to another investor, not African, said founder isn't a majority shareholder, will the founder startup should qualify to apply to Madica? If the startup has a female African founder, but due to... So I think there are two questions here. If a startup has a female African founder, but she's not a majority shareholder, that's one question. Is the startup itself, does it have majority African shareholding? I think that's the important question. Whether the co-founder or the female co-founder owned 10% or 5%, 50% of the company, is it owned by Africans? If yes, then that is a clear case of we could do it or explore it. But if not, it doesn't matter what you hold. If majority is not African owned, then that would be a very tough sell. Maximum funding amount is 200K. Minimum would be, I believe, will be based on how much the founders have outstanding in their round. If the round is not large enough to accommodate 200K and they only want to do 150, then we can go back to the IC and say, hey, can we approve 150 instead of 200 for the startup? So we're flexible on the minimum, but on the maximum, it is 200K right now standard. How long does it take after the application has cleared to get funds to start up that are ready for Madica investment? After application and screening, usually there's the due diligence, 4 to 6 weeks. And then there's legal, which if we're using the lowest estimate of say 2 weeks, that would be 8 weeks, best case. Worst case, legal and, preconditions for investments or contract signing could take longer. So I'd say on the lower end is like 8 weeks. The higher end, it could take, a few additional weeks, depending on how fast the startups can actually rectify their legal process to accept Madica funding. So I think we have just 10 minutes left on the call. I'm also very mindful of time, so I would just take 1 or 2 more questions and move. Startup's product has gained significant organic traction over the past 4 years. With nearly 900K has used the product. Over 2.5 million impressions and more than 620K leads generated. However, no revenue has been generated yet, as monetization wasn't the initial focus. Now the company is considering transitioning to a monetization strategy. Given this strategy, how would you define and evaluate the traction achieved so far? What key indicators would you analyze to assess its readiness for monetization? And how would this be defined as traction since the market fit has been clarified? I mean, I think this question already answers itself. Um, I think in this case, particularly in the African ecosystem or African markets, what we found is that, look, freemium is, I mean, every investor would probably have their own, or anyone you ask will have their own opinion. I think I personally, um, it's good that you have freemium users or people who are using the platform. I think the major challenge generally will stem from when you try to monetize. For products that usually have freemium and paid, what you find is that a higher percentage of customers would remain freemium than pay. At least not enough of them we have seen would pay enough to make that a sustainable business or a scalable business. So while in this case, there's significant traction in terms of, guys using the platform or impressions, in this case, I would still want to see that you have the ability to actually monetize. And in this case, I think it would be a case of why don't you monetize and let's have a conversation once you have. This is really great traction, but I think we understand the challenge with transitioning from user signups to paid users, and we want to see how that is being addressed before we make a commitment. Do you assist fintech players with various regulatory approvals in various markets across Africa? Assist in terms of introductions, understanding the landscape, yes. We have experts in the network that you can always leverage. If there's specific people you need introductions to, that's also one of the things that we can help with. So definitely from an introduction to expert standpoint, yes. Do you invest in Web3 startups? I think we're open to exploring those. We haven't done any Web3 yet, but it will be very interesting if we find some that are really, really innovative and disruptive and fit into our strategic criteria. Yes, definitely. You invest in agricultural processing innovations. For example, the startup that have innovated new products from agricultural harvest. We haven't seen that, but if there's something that is very interesting about it and you think is worth having a conversation, well, more than happy to always have conversations, quite frankly. But we just haven't, I don't think we've seen anyone in the past that is doing that. But yeah, we're happy to review that. Have you closed your 2025 cohort? I got stuck at stage 2, or rather I didn't get a response on it. Someone shared a very similar feedback. On the one hand, we don't want a cohort model. We accept applications on a rolling basis, so you can apply at any time. If you've been in stage 2 longer than 2 weeks, either one of two things have happened. Either we've sent a response and it's in spam, or if it's longer than 2 weeks, either you check spam if we have sent a response and you missed it, or just send us another message or an email and we'll follow up on that on your behalf. Congratulations on the 2-mile investment. I was on the journey takeover of the founders. Are you investing in health tech? Yes, we are. We have a health tech investment as we speak. So more than happy to explore that tech. At a pressed level, what does the DD entail? I don't know what pressed mean, but if you're asking about high level, what DD entails, so it's anything from one, sharing your data room and all, documentations that are critical for us, both legal, company, financial, and details on your management team, market research, product demos, and more importantly, introductions to specific people that we would, request. So your investors, your partners, your, experts, we'll have specific list of people. Really, what the objective of DD is, by the time we are inviting you to DD, we already have a sense that this is so interesting play. There's something here, and we want to do it. What DD helps us do is to build conviction in that, in that, in why we were interested in the first place. So being able to have now a tangible report that we can go to ICE and say, this is why we believe in this startup or this idea. And it's anything from giving us all the information we have from an internal standpoint in the products, in the team, the financials, to speaking with experts and validating, all of those metrics for us to be able to say, hey, we now have conviction, we have a report. Let's go and see if we can get you an investment. For startups that already applied, when do they get selected for the program? I mean, timeline from now. Additionally, if you're selected, you are saying that the funds are issued first before starting the program. Yes, our funds come in before program. The program is a post-investment support. So you get investment first. That is our first or primary priority. And then have a conversation around what the next 18 months could look like. Now that you have the funds to grow your business, how do you want to scale it? And where can Madica help? In terms of timelines, I would say, to make it a lot clearer, stage 1 and stage 2 applications could be, maybe between stage 1 and stage 2, let's say 2 weeks. Stage 2 and screening call another 2 weeks. So if you're in stage 2, between stage 2 and screening call, it could be a week, depending on founders' availability. And then between screening call and feedback for DD could be another 2 weeks. So depending on what stage you are, it could be anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks from DD. What if a startup founder has solely been self-funded before applying to Madica? Is the absence of other investors or partners disqualifying factor? No, not at all. Is there an application deadline? There are no deadlines. It's a rolling application. What's your appetite for EdTech? I think we have strong appetite for any interesting sectors. We have made a commitment to an EdTech as well. Share the link of an application on the chat. Sure, we will do that. Do you require a technical person on the team? Preferably, but it's not a deal breaker if you don't. But it's good to have it, not just for Madica, but I think for any startup. For registration in UK, do you know any specific UK countries that will go through those registrations? I think the legal team can advise on who they've worked with or within their network. So at that point, I think you would have a healthy list of experts that that could be advised on. And I think we're just about time. So unfortunately, I think the last few questions are right. How long before you can reply if you were rejected? I think a fair timeline is 3 months. I think if you were rejected at between stage 1 and stage 2, you want to wait maybe say minimum of 3 months to ensure you have, if it's a traction issue, a bit more traction and come back with. In some cases, you can ask for feedback. Even though between stage 1 and stage 2, it's a bit challenging to provide direct feedback because of the volume of applications that we receive. But in some rare cases, we could provide certain feedback. But I would advise that, the gap between when you apply the first time and if you're thinking about applying again, give it a 3 months timeline. I think a lot more would have happened for you to be able to come and say, hey, this was what happened the last time, this is where I am. And that could be a stronger case. The innovative AI-based solution eligible to submit? Yes. We have actually, I think we're very concentrated on AI. The portfolio right now has a very high concentration of AI. So yes, if you are AI, you're more than welcome to apply. If it's innovative and it stands out, we're always happy to have conversations around this. I'm a fintech founder in Ghana building a credit option platform. One idea building an MVP. We have some traction, but not in revenue. With that work for Madica, my advice is maybe come back to Madica when you actually have an MVP. And if again, look, if you want to have more conversation around this, I'm sure, even though we have lots of applications that we're reviewing constantly, we could make our time to, have a chat with founders, even if you don't apply, say you want to apply, but you want to, brainstorm on what makes sense. Oftentimes, we have had calls like that with founders. But the general preference is that, apply when there's MVP and there's some traction. I think it's a lot more helpful. And that's the last question. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been really great, and I hope I've been able to answer most of the questions, if not all satisfactorily. In terms of how to apply, I'll just type it in the chat. If you're thinking about making an application, it's madica.vc/apply. You can set in applications. We do our best to review applications on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and always come back with feedback to, startups that are moving on to the next stage. For startups that may not be moving on to the next stage, you also get some feedback in that sense. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone. If you have more questions, I think, you're more than welcome to send them via email. This recording will also be made available online, so you can always rewatch it or share within your network. As helpful as that may be, but I'm really appreciative of you taking out the time to join the call, something today the public holiday, and we're learning a lot more about Madica, and I appreciate everyone else. So thank you so much, and I think we did well on time, so I'll let you get back to your day now. Great, thank you.